All right, imagine a sport. Okay. It was once so popular, like seriously popular. It was practically an obsession. People from Queen Victoria all the way to like just your average person playing.
Oh, yeah. And even set off like some fashion trends.
Exactly. So are you ready to dive into the world of croquet?
I am.
Well, today we're going to be looking at its history.
It's a pretty amazing trip from like the 13th century in France all the way to Wimbledon.
We've got a ton of stuff like historical accounts
Yeah.
and rule books, even some crazy stories to unpack. So are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's go.
All right. So first off,
Yeah.
when did croquet actually start?
Finding the exact beginning of croquet, it's kind of like trying to hit one of those moving wickets.
Uh-huh.
It seems like it probably, just grew over time, like centuries.
Yeah.
With, whispers of similar games, like way back.
Okay, so it's a bit as a mystery then.
Yeah.
But we do have like some clues.
Right. Yes, we do. While we don't know for sure, historians think that something like croquet might have been played in Brittany, France, like as early as the 13th century. Imagine, shepherds using their crooks to whack wooden balls through these hoops. They were made of willow branches.
Wow, that sounds pretty rustic.
Yes, it does.
But how did it get to England? To like those big estates?
That's where things get even more interesting. By the 17th century, we see this game called Pall Mall just sweeping through England. Picture a really long, narrow alley.
Okay.
Okay. And it's powdered with crushed cockle shells.
Wow.
And players, they use mallets to carefully guide the ball through these arches.
So it's pretty intense.
It was a game that, captivated everyone, from King Charles II himself to, just everyday people.
Pall Mall, that's like kind of an aggressive name.
It is.
Was it like a rough game?
Maybe not as rough as like a jousting match, but it had its moments. There are these stories of like crazy matches and these prized balls and even like some scandals.
Oh, scandals. I'm listening.
Okay, so there's this story about a legendary Pall Mall ball. It was called the Bernard. It was made from the finest dudgeon wood. And it was so valuable, like people really wanted it. But the owner, he refused to sell it, even when someone offered him 30 pistols in trade.
Wait, hold on. 30 pistols for a ball. That's crazy. It sounds like, Pall Mall was more than just some game people played.
Absolutely.
So how did it become, the croquet we know today?
Well, here's where we jump across the map a little bit. You see, Pall Mall kind of lost its popularity in England, but it took hold in Ireland. And it transformed into this game they called Cookie. This was in the 1830s.
Did they just, change the name? Or did they actually, do something different with the game?
That's a really good question, and it gets at a really important point. While croquet definitely shares some, ancestry with these older games, it's not just a rebranded Pall Mall or Cookie. In the middle of the 19th century, something really important happened. Standardized rules showed up.
The rules, that's the foundation of a game, right?
Absolutely.
So having, the same rules everywhere, that must have been tough back then.
You're so right. Early croquet was kind of like a free-for-all. Different areas, different groups, they all played by their own rules. It's like trying to hit a wicket.
Yeah.
When the goalposts are always moving.
So who, stepped in to sort it all out?
Well, this is where a pretty cool guy comes in, Walter Jones Whitmore. By day, he was a government clerk. But he loved croquet.
Yeah.
He knew that if croquet was going to really take off, it needed rules. Everybody had to play the same way.
So he was the father of croquet?
Yeah.
The inventor?
In a lot of ways, yeah. In 1866, he published what he called the Field Rules. They were these guidelines, really comprehensive, to make sure everyone played on a level playing field. Pun intended.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So did these field rules work?
They did. People followed them, and they became really influential, but Whitmore didn't stop there.
Oh.
He also wrote a whole book, The Science of Croquet, organized the first real croquet tournament in England, which, by the way, he won.
No.
Yeah. And get this. He founded a club. You might have heard of it. The All England Croquet Club.
Hold on. The All England Croquet Club. You mean like the Wimbledon All England Club?
The one and only. But we'll get to that story later. Right now, let's focus on how Whitmore turned croquet from just a casual game into a real sport. With strategy and skill and, a touch of prestige.
So it's like one guy who was really passionate about croquet really changed the game.
Yeah. Pretty amazing, isn't it?
It is. But croquet wasn't just for super competitive people, right?
Oh, right.
It seems like everyone played.
Oh, absolutely. And that's actually really fascinating when you think about what life was like back then in the Victorian era. Croquet was a way for men and women to get together, in a socially acceptable setting, often in these beautiful gardens with lawns for parties.
Oh, I can see it now. The ladies in their dresses, strategically placing their croquet balls, maybe exchanging glances across the lawn.
You're really painting a picture there. And while that might sound romantic, we do need to remember that things were complicated for women who played croquet back then.
So even though it seemed like, a totally fine activity for women, there were still like hidden rules, right, about how they should act.
Yeah, there were. Women were often told to be, kind of restrained, to focus on being graceful and elegant rather than, powerful or super competitive.
So even though croquet was supposed to be for everyone, society still had its expectations.
Yeah, that's true. And it's by looking at these details that we can really understand, what it was like back then and the challenges that people face.
Okay, but before we get too sidetracked, let's go back to that connection between croquet and Wimbledon. It's amazing that the most famous tennis tournament in the world started with a croquet club.
Isn't that wild? As we mentioned earlier, Walter Jones Whitmore, he needed more space for his All England Croquet Club, so he moved it near the Wimbledon train station. And that was a game changer. The club's name became linked with the place.
So it was like a lucky coincidence. Location, location, location.
I guess you could say that. But it also shows how things change and adapt. See, tennis became super popular in the late 1800s. So the All England Croquet Club realized, hey, we need to get on board with this new sport to stay relevant.
And that's how the All England Croquet and Lawn Tennis Club was born in 1875. But what happened to croquet? Did it just disappear when tennis took over?
Croquet did become less popular at Wimbledon, but it never fully went away. In fact, they even changed the name back to the All England Lawn Tennis and Croquet Club in 1899 to acknowledge, that croquet was still there.
So croquet was like the guest who wouldn't leave the party, just hanging out while everyone got excited about tennis.
I like that. And, it shows that even things that seem kind of niche can still have a lasting impact. The fact that Wimbledon, the home of tennis, started as a croquet club, that tells you something about the power of this game, even though it doesn't always get the spotlight.
Speaking of not getting the spotlight, let's talk about croquet in the U.S. I mean, it wasn't just a British thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. Croquet had its own adventure in America. It was super popular in the late 1800s, but by the mid-1900s, it had become kind of like a relic of the past, something you'd play in your backyard at a family barbecue.
So it needed like a revival,
Yeah,
a kickstart.
exactly.
Mm.
And that's where Jack Osborne comes in.
Jack Osborne.
He was a successful entrepreneur, and he loved croquet. In the 1970s, he saw that croquet could be big again, but it needed an update.
So he was like the croquet marketing whiz.
You got it.
What'd he do?
Well, he knew that one reason people didn't play much croquet was because it was kind of complicated. The traditional game, with 9 wickets on a big court, it could be too much for beginners. So he decided to change things up.
A croquet revolution.
He started the United States Croquet Association, the USCA, in 1977.
Oh, wow.
And he introduced a simpler version, 6 wickets instead of 9, played on a smaller court.
6 wickets. That's a big change. Why did he do that?
Osborne thought this 6-wicket version was perfect for, most American homes. It didn't need as much space, was easier to learn, and everyone could play, no matter how good they were.
So he made it more American-friendly for backyard fun and stuff.
Exactly. And guess what? It worked. The USCA grew like crazy under Osborne, and 6-wicket croquet became the most popular version in the U.S.
What about the people who liked the old way, with 9 wickets? Were they left out?
No, not at all. Another group of players who wanted to stick with the original rules formed their own association, the American Croquet Association, or ACA, in 1987. They were all about that 9-wicket game and serious competition.
So now there were 2 croquet groups in America. Was it like a rivalry?
There might have been some differences at first, but both groups had the same goal, to make croquet popular in America. Over time, a lot of people belong to both. And these days, the USCA actually handles most of the events that use those international 9-wicket rules.
So it was like a team effort to spread the word about croquet.
Exactly. Whether you're playing a relaxed game in your backyard or you're in a serious tournament, it's all croquet.
And that really shows what's great about croquet, right? It's a game for everyone.
You got it.
Okay, so we've talked about the game, but what about the equipment? The mallets and balls.
Right.
They must have changed a lot, too, over time.
They have. Just like the game itself, croquet equipment has evolved a lot. New technologies, different tastes, and changing styles of play.
So from those simple tools to the high-tech stuff they use today. That's a pretty interesting story, right?
It is. In the early days, those mallets, they were pretty rough, just simple wood. Imagine those shepherds, using crooks to guide those wooden balls.
Sounds like something out of a history book.
Yeah.
But how did they become the fancy equipment we see today?
Well, as croquet became more popular and like a real sport,
Yeah.
people wanted better stuff. Craftsmen started trying different materials and designs. They wanted to make the mallets and balls last longer and work better.
So they had to get creative.
Totally. And one of the biggest changes was using metal for the mallet heads.
Okay.
And they started using hardwoods for the handles, like lignum vitae. That made them way tougher.
Lignum vitae, isn't that like a super strong wood?
Yeah, it's one of the densest woods out there. It was perfect for mallet handles. Really powerful and precise.
I bet those mallets felt good to swing. What about the balls? Did they change too?
Of course. You see those early wooden balls?
Yeah.
They were cute, but, you couldn't always predict how they'd bounce. As the game got more serious, they started making balls from other stuff, like compressed rubber and resin. They were more consistent in size, weight, and how they bounced.
So with the better equipment, croquet became more refined. Like you could really play with strategy.
Exactly. Players could hit the ball exactly where they wanted, and that made the game more challenging and skillful.
It's really cool how better equipment actually changed how the game was played, right?
Yeah.
People had to develop new skills to use those tools properly.
And that's still happening. Companies are always trying to make even better croquet gear. New materials, new designs to keep the game exciting and challenging.
It just goes to show that even games and leisure activities can evolve. We're always trying to improve and see what's possible.
And that's what's so cool about exploring these stories of innovation. From the very first croquet games to how it's played today, you really get to see how human ingenuity and creativity have shaped this simple yet surprisingly complex game.
So we've gone through croquet's past, from its simple beginnings to the modern game. But now I'm curious about croquet today. Is it still popular, or has it become a bit more of a niche thing?
Another great question. And the answer is a little of both. Croquet might not be as everywhere as it was back in the Victorian days, but it's definitely not gone. It's been making a comeback lately, attracting all kinds of players, from folks who just want to have fun outside to serious competitors who play in tournaments.
It's interesting how the popularity of a game can change over time. So what's behind this new interest in croquet?
I think it's a few things. Croquet is a great mix of physical activity, strategy, and social interaction. You can play no matter how old you are or how good you are. It's a perfect activity for families and friends to enjoy together.
It's a game that brings people together, right?
Yep.
And it makes you think. I think that's a really attractive combination in the world today.
Absolutely. And in a time when everyone is glued to their screens and, constantly bombarded with digital stuff, croquet offers a chance to unplug, you get some fresh air, and use your brain and body.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the simplest things are the best, right?
Yes.
But I'm curious, how has croquet adapted to, this digital age? Has technology changed the game at all?
Technology has had an impact on croquet. But maybe not in the way you might think. Sure, some people have tried to make virtual croquet games, but the real beauty of croquet is in the physical experience. Feeling the mallet hit the ball, hearing that click against the wickets, the fun of playing with others on the lawn. It's tough to get that same feeling in a digital world.
I get what you mean. It's a game that needs to be played in the real world. But technology has still had some influence, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. While virtual reality hasn't taken over croquet, technology has connected players and fans all around the world. We've got online forums, social media groups, and websites where people who love croquet can connect, share tips, talk strategy, and even organize games.
So even though it's a traditional game, technology has actually helped build a community around it.
Exactly. And this online presence has been great for competitive croquet. You can watch tournaments online now, so people all over the world can follow along and root for their favorites.
That's amazing. So what about the future of croquet? Do you think it's going to keep growing?
I think croquet has a bright future. As people look for more fulfilling ways to spend their free time, croquet is a great option. It's a game that connects people, keeps you active both physically and mentally, and it's got just the right amount of competition.
Well said. This deep dive into croquet has been really interesting. From its humble beginnings to its staying power in this digital world. We've uncovered some surprising facts, debunked some myths, and looked at how society and technology have shaped this game.
And I think the most important thing we've learned is that croquet is more than just a game. It reflects our history, how technology changes things, and our desire to connect with others, challenge ourselves, and, have some fun out in the sun.
Absolutely.
So, picture this. A young woman, relatively new to the game, going up against a champion in a really important match. It must have been intense.
It sounds like she was a real underdog. What happened in the match?
Well, Gower surprised everybody. She won the first game, showed some real skill and strategy, but her opponent, his name was C.E. Willis.
Okay.
He was a tough player, and he came back strong in the second game to tie things up.
Wow, a real nail-biter. So it all came down to the last game.
You got it. And that third game, it showed how resilient and talented Gower was. She won, and not just by a little bit. She had a 26-point lead.
That's a pretty decisive win. What was the reaction like? Did people accept her as a champion, or was there pushback because she was a woman?
Gower's win shook up the croquet world. Some of the old guard might have grumbled, but for the most part, her win was celebrated. The newspapers called her the Croquet Queen, and her achievement showed everyone that croquet wasn't just some casual game, it was a real sport.
It's amazing how one event can change how people see things. Did Gower inspire other women to start playing croquet more competitively?
It's hard to say for sure, but her success definitely set an example. And remember, Gower wasn't alone. There were a lot of talented women playing croquet back then, but their stories often got overlooked. They were just seen as playing society games.
It's a good reminder that history isn't always told from everyone's point of view. Sometimes you got to dig a little deeper to find the stories of those who didn't get the recognition they deserved.
Absolutely. And as we look more closely at how women were involved in croquet, it's important to go beyond those pretty pictures of garden parties. There were real limitations for women back then.
You mentioned clothing earlier. How did that affect women's ability to play?
Well, those long flowing dresses, they might have looked elegant,
Right.
but they were really hard to move in on the croquet lawn. Imagine trying to make a precise shot with all that fabric getting in the way.
I can only imagine. Sounds like it would be pretty tough.
Yeah, it was. And besides the practical challenges, there were also social pressures about how women were supposed to act while playing.
So even though it was okay for women to play croquet, there were still these unwritten rules about being ladylike.
Exactly. Women were expected to play in a certain way, with grace and elegance, not with too much power or competitiveness.
It shows that even activities that seem inclusive can still be shaped by, society's expectations, right?
Absolutely. And it's by looking at these details that we can really understand what things were like back then and the challenges that people faced.
Okay, so let's get back to that Wimbledon connection. I'm still amazed that the most famous tennis tournament in the world started with a croquet club.
It's a pretty cool story, right? So, as we talked about before, Walter Jones Whitmore, he needed more room for his club, so he moved it near the Wimbledon train station. And that ended up being really important because the club's name became associated with the area.
That's like fate.
In a way, yeah. But it also shows how things change. Tennis got really popular in the late 1800s, so the All England Croquet Club decided to get on board with the new trend to stay relevant.
And that's how we got the All England Croquet and Lawn Tennis Club in 1875. But what happened to croquet? Did it just fade away when tennis became the big thing?
Well, croquet's popularity did go down at Wimbledon, but it never completely vanished. The club even changed its name back to the All England Lawn Tennis and Croquet Club in 1899 to acknowledge, that croquet was still there.
So it was like croquet was always there in the background, even though everyone was getting excited about tennis.
You could say that, and it shows how even those activities that seem kind of niche can still have a lasting impact. Wimbledon, the home of tennis. Well, it all started with a croquet club.
Right. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about croquet in America.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a British thing.
No way! Croquet had its own journey in America. It was a huge hit in the late 1800s, but by the middle of the 1900s, it had kind of become, a bit old-fashioned, something you'd play at a family gathering in the backyard.
So it needed a comeback.
Yeah, it needed some energy, and that's where Jack Osborne enters the scene.
Okay, tell me about Jack Osborne.
He was a successful businessman, and he loved croquet. In the 1970s, he saw that croquet could be popular again, but it needed a refresh.
It sounds like he was a real visionary, so what did he do?
He realized that one of the reasons people weren't playing much croquet was because it could be a little intimidating. The traditional game, with 9 wickets and a big court, it was a lot for beginners to handle. So he decided to simplify things.
Sorry.
He founded the United States Croquet Association, we call it the USCA. This was in 1977.
1977.
And he introduced a new version of croquet. It had 6 wickets instead of 9, and and it was played on a smaller court.
6 wickets. That's a big change. Why make it simpler?
Osborne believed that six-wicket croquet was a better fit for, the average American homeowner. It didn't need as much space, was easier to learn, and anyone could play, no matter their skill level.
So he made it more accessible, more fun for casual play.
You got it. And it was a huge success. The USCA grew a lot under Osborne's leadership, and this six-wicket croquet became the most popular version in the United States.
But what about the people who preferred the traditional game with 9 wickets?
Don't worry, they weren't forgotten. In 1987, a group of players who wanted to stick with the international rules, they formed their own association. They called it the American Croquet Association, the ACA. Their focus was on promoting 9-wicket croquet and high-level competition.
So now we have 2 croquet associations in the U.S. Did that create like a rivalry?
Well, there might have been some differences in approach at the beginning, but both organizations shared the same goal. They wanted to make croquet more popular in America. Over time, a lot of people ended up being members of both, and today the USCA actually manages most of the events that use the international 9-wicket rules.
So they're all working together to promote croquet. That's great.
Exactly. Whether you're playing for fun in your backyard or competing at a high level, it's all croquet. And that's part of what makes the game so special. It can be whatever you want it to be.
Speaking of what makes croquet special, let's talk about the equipment. The mallets, the balls, they must have changed a lot over the years.
Oh, absolutely. Just like the game itself, croquet equipment has gone through its own fascinating evolution. New technology, different tastes, changing styles of play.
It's a long way from those simple tools to the high-tech equipment they use today, right?
It is. In the early days, the mallets were very basic, just pieces of wood. Imagine those shepherds we talked about, using their crooks to hit those early wooden balls through willow hoops.
That sounds incredibly rustic.
Sure.
So how did we go from that to the more sophisticated equipment we see today?
Well, as croquet became more popular and, more of a formal sport, the demand for better equipment grew. People wanted tools that would last longer and help them play better. Craftsmen started experimenting with different materials and designs.
A classic case of necessity breeding innovation, right?
Exactly. One of the most important changes was using metal for the mallet heads. And they started using hardwoods for the handles, like lignum vitae.
Right.
It made the mallets much more durable.
Lignum vitae. Isn't that one of the densest woods in the world?
It is. It's incredibly strong and dense, perfect for mallet handles. It gave players more power and precision.
I bet those mallets were a joy to swing.
Yeah.
And what about the balls? Did they go through a similar transformation?
They did. Those old wooden balls,
Yeah.
well, charming. They weren't always predictable. You know how they bounced? As croquet evolved, they started making balls from composite materials like compressed rubber and resin. They were much more consistent in terms of weight, size, and how they bounced.
So with this improved equipment, croquet became a more refined and predictable game.
Exactly. It allowed players to hit the ball with more accuracy and control. It really raised the level of play and pushed the boundaries of what was possible on the croquet lawn.
It's fascinating how even something as simple as the equipment can shape how a game is played. Players had to come up with new techniques and strategies to master those new tools.
Absolutely. And that drive to refine and improve continues today. Companies are always looking for ways to make even better croquet gear. They're experimenting with new materials, new designs, all to make sure the game stays exciting and challenging.
It just shows that even in games and leisure activities, there's always room for innovation and progress. It's that human desire to always be improving and pushing the limits.
It is, and it's by exploring those stories of innovation. From those simple beginnings to the modern game, you gain a real appreciation for the creativity and ingenuity that has shaped this game. It might seem simple, but it's actually incredibly complex.
Oh, true. Okay, so we've looked at croquet's past, from its humble beginnings to its modern forms. Now let's talk about croquet today. Is it still a popular pastime in our busy, tech-driven world?
That's a great question. And the answer is, well, it's a bit of both. It's definitely not as widespread as it was, back in the Victorian era, but it's definitely not disappearing either. It's actually seen a bit of a resurgence lately.
A resurgence?
Yeah. It's attracting all sorts of players, from people who just want a relaxing outdoor activity to, well, those who love that competitive tournament scene.
That's interesting. So what's driving this renewed interest?
I think it's a combination of things. Croquet offers, a little bit of physical activity, a bit of strategy, and it's social. It's a game that people of all ages and skill levels can enjoy together. It's great for families, friends, you name it.
It's appealing to, like, our competitive side and our need to connect with others.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty powerful combination, especially today.
Exactly. And in a world that's so dominated by screens and, all things digital, croquet offers a chance to disconnect, get some fresh air, and engage in something, well, real. Something that requires both, physical and mental agility.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the simplest things are the most rewarding. But I'm curious, how has croquet adapted to this digital age? Has technology had any impact on the game?
Well, technology has definitely left its mark on croquet, but maybe not in the way you'd expect.
Yeah.
There have been some attempts to create virtual croquet games, but the true essence of croquet, it lies in that physical experience. The feel of the mallet striking the ball, the sound of the ball clicking against the wickets, the camaraderie among players on the lawn. These are elements that are really hard to recreate in a digital environment.
I see what you mean. It's a game that's best experienced in person, with all the senses engaged in that social interaction you can only get face to face. But technology hasn't been completely absent from croquet. Right.
You're right. Virtual reality might not have taken over croquet, but technology has definitely helped to connect players and enthusiasts all over the world. Online forums, social media groups, dedicated websites. These platforms give croquet lovers a space to share tips, discuss strategies, organize events.
So in a way, technology has helped to build a global community around croquet.
Exactly. And this online presence has been particularly beneficial for promoting competitive croquet.
Okay.
Tournaments are now streamed online, allowing fans from all corners of the globe to follow the action and cheer on their favorite players.
It's pretty amazing how technology can both connect and expand the reach of a game that, at its core is so traditional. So looking ahead, what's the future of croquet? Do you see it continuing to thrive?
I believe croquet has a very bright future. As people search for more meaningful and engaging ways to spend their leisure time, croquet offers a really compelling alternative to that digital overload we often face. It's a game that fosters connections, promotes well-being, both physical and mental, and of course, it provides that healthy dose of competition.
I like that. It's been a fascinating journey exploring the world of croquet with you, from its humble beginnings to its enduring appeal in this digital age. We've unearthed surprising connections, debunked some myths, and examined the forces, both social and technological, that have shaped this captivating game.
And I think most importantly, we've learned that croquet is much more than just a game. It's a reflection of our history, our technological advancements, and our enduring human desire for connection, competition, and, well, bit of fun on a sunny afternoon.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, what does all of this mean for you, our listener? Maybe it's piqued your interest in trying croquet yourself, whether it's a casual game with friends, or maybe even dipping your toes into the world of competitive tournaments. Or perhaps it's simply giving you a newfound appreciation for the rich history and lasting appeal of this often overlooked game.
Whatever you take away from this deep dive, we encourage you to explore the world of croquet, uncover its hidden stories, and experience the joy and the challenge it offers.
And as always, we invite you to join us for more deep dives into the fascinating world of, well, everyday things. We'll unravel more mysteries, challenge assumptions, and uncover those hidden stories that connect us all.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those croquet mallets handy. You never know when you might need them.